Good to be with you, created souls. I'm your host, Joshua Farris. I want to talk to you about a few things, additional thoughts related to the recent EPS conference where we had a uh, symposium on the book, The Origin of the Soul. In particular, I want to talk about panpsychism. And we had one contributor who was an advocate for panpsychism, particularly what she calls theological panpsychism, by Joanna Leidenhag, who is the co-editor of the collection with me. Um, as I noted at the conference in the symposium, panpsychism is a trendy philosophy. A trendy philosophy. And it really is. It's quite trendy right now, and it is trending quite a bit. And people, academics and scholars and pseudo scholars, as well as pseudo spiritualists, are advocating for it and capitalizing on the recent discussions related to it. Um, but even though it's trendy and it has some things going for it, it has certainly some appeal. It also has some deep problems. What is this trend? Panpsychism, I said, is trendy, and I'm thankful for panpsychism for a variety of reasons because it's opened up fresh conversations about the nature of persons, the meaning of the universe, God himself, and the possibility that there is actually a God who explains the universe. I think it's opened up that. It's also received, although I would say, far too much attention in recent contemporary discussions and has, again, some significant problems. I also stated that it's trendy in the sense that it's like clickbait for academics. Of course, there's the guru type version of it that's also trending for popular consumption, and that too deserves some significant critique. But what is panpsychism? That's quite a technical term and it's quite a mouthful. What is panpsychism? Panpsychism is, you might say, the philosophical theory that consciousness is a fundamental aspect of reality, that all things possess a mind or mind-like quality to it, or a mind disposition, or something of the sort. There's, of course, a variety of different types of panpsychism, but I don't want to treat it too trivially or simplify it too much, but that might be the kind of singular essential claim to it. The term derives from the Greek words pan, meaning all, and psyche, meaning soul. All has soul or all has mind. And the theory is characterized by several key ideas. The idea that mind is fundamental. In other words, mind is not this sort of combination of lower level properties or physical parts, as in materialism. It has a bit more going for it than materialism. It's not emergent property of complex systems, although there are emergentist versions of it that give rise to higher level minds. But it itself is not primarily an emergent property of complex systems, but it is a fundamental part of existence or of nature itself, even if you trend or tend toward a more physicalist version of it, where all physical things have mind or mindedness or mind dispositional qualities, it itself is fundamental. The ubiquity of consciousness. Consciousness, again, is this universal feature of reality or existence or of nature. In other words, it's present in all entities to varying degrees. There are, of course, analogies, and this is one of the problems that needs to be raised and developed further and in popular contexts as well as more academic contexts, and that is that uh, panpsychists draw analogies between human consciousness and these purported or assumed underlying minds or mental states of non-human entities that are along the evolutionary chain. There's also the view of expansive consciousness. The theory suggests that there is much more consciousness in the universe than is often commonly assumed, even more than what is commonsensically assumed. A brief historical context. There's often this claim that historically panpsychism really can be traced quite far back to earlier philosophical traditions, including the pre-Socratic thinkers, and as well as it can be found arguably in various forms of animism in ancient cultures. Prominent thinkers like Spinoza, the philosopher Spinoza in the modern period, uh, and Leibniz are also advanced as versions or representatives of panpsychism and its broader commitments to other metaphysical issues. There are others who have also been held up as representatives in history. And while it may be true, it's certainly interesting and worth discussion. It also seems to be a bit misleading at times, and the claim seems to be a bit overstated as panpsychism has come on the fore as quite prominent and quite popular, again, trendy. And that is because panpsychism uh, doesn't stand on its own, arguably. The famous philosopher David Skrbina has been famous for arguing for this idea that panpsychism has been around for a long time and it has a historical pedigree to it. It's a serious live position, especially now as it's gained popularity in recent history. But it's possible that, again, this is overstated. These thinkers contemporarily who are advocating for this need to realize that panpsychism itself is likely a version of substance dualism, which is more historical, or idealism, or, especially more recently in contemporary discussions, inclined toward more of a view of physicalism. And but not all panpsychists recognize this or will highlight this fact because it gives credence to a set of views, arguably, that they are trying to distance themselves from, that have not seen the same sort of contemporary attention and been highlighted as much. And also, probably, I would suggest strongly that there's a connotation given to them when they are associated with these other metaphysical systems like substance dualism or idealism. So I think there is more discussion to be had there, and an important one at that. There are, of course, or is a recent interest in panpsychism that is important to highlight. Its recent history really stems from, arguably, from versions of secularism that denounce the belief in God or theism or some version of theism. And it comes out of, arguably, a kind of more naturalistic system that sees the world as explanatorily made sense of by nature itself and the mechanisms within nature. Panpsychism has experienced a revival, largely as a response to the so-called problem of the hard problem of consciousness, articulated arguably by the philosopher David Chalmers. And the problem highlights the difficulty of explaining how it is that subjective experiences arise from physical processes. Panpsychism's resurgence owes much to philosophers such as Galen Strawson, as well as even more recently, who's become quite a popular figure and has gained lots of attention and has had been platformed in many places, Philip Goff, the philosopher Philip Goff, who argues that it offers a plausible alternative to the predominant view within analytic and contemporary philosophy, namely materialism and its naturalistic heritage. Also, its plausible alternative in contrast to what he calls dualism. So that has, in part, been some of the motivation for this trend toward panpsychism. So this trend is undeniable. It appeals to those who are seeking some kind of elegant solution to the problem of consciousness, especially in light of evolution and the scientific explanations of the world. And it resonates, arguably, with a broader academic consensus or sentiment, arguably, you might say, even maybe broader cultural movements that emphasize the interconnectedness of nature and evolution. However, its rise has also sparked critical discussions and important ones about its theoretical coherence as well as the practical implications that follow from it. Of course, some of those practical implications raise questions about the nature of science, reality, as well as the possibility of theism, which I think is quite important. But it also kind of recoils against it to some degree in ways that deserve attention and deserve critique. The naturalistic and secularistic heritage from which it comes is an important one, and one that we cannot um, uh, ignore or deny or uh, eschew. Then there's the theological panpsychism, which Joanna Leidenhag, my co-editor of The Origin of the Soul conversation, uh, has advocated for, and she's advocated for a quite nuanced approach, and I'm quite happy with her approach. I think it's better than the secular alternatives, and I'm thankful that she's offering a sort of theistic alternative, and I think she's become kind of gained some famous or popularity as a result of it, and so I appreciate that, and I appreciate her work. I want to say that right up front, of course. And I appreciate the potential attempts that she's made, that it has supplied some kind of potential framework for understanding the soul as well as the nature of and meaning of the universe in a theistic frame. As she says, panpsychism is explained better by theism. And I think that's right. I think that's, and I appreciate that. Her theological panpsychism attempts to integrate panpsychist principles with Christian theology, and I think that's a good thing. That's a positive development, proposing that consciousness pervades creation and that this insight can enrich, she argues, theological anthropology, which she argues in her chapter in the book, as well as in her earlier monograph, great monograph, Minding Creation. I think that's the title. But there's a problem with that. And it's a not insignificant problem. It's a problem of starting with panpsychism in theology altogether. And this is something that really became quite highlighted in the discussion at the symposium at EPS. And I think it's an important one that we cannot ignore and we must press. And I think we need to press in a bit harder in different ways. While Leidenhag's efforts are commendable, starting with panpsychism as a foundation for theological construction presents significant challenges. In other words, if you approach theology from a kind of faith-seeking understanding program, it's a problem to start with panpsychism from the get-go because it creates problems that are already integral to or fundamental to a Christian theological system itself. So why begin with it? That's the problem. Why begin with a philosophical system that is foreign to Christian theology in many ways and that itself creates initial problems from the get-go, even foundational problems from the get-go regarding specific theological commitments about the nature of creation and the nature of the human itself? Let me explain briefly. There are clear anthropological issues with beginning with panpsychism, because on most versions, again, I'm simplifying it just for the sake of summarizing the problem, and I'll try to explain a little bit more detail why there's a problem with it. Panpsychism struggles to account for the endurance of individual human persons, and particularly the endurance of persons into the afterlife, into the intermediate state where there's a disembodied state, as well as into the physical resurrection, of which that in itself becomes a huge question for panpsychists, how it is, in fact, that they could account for the survival of the person or the soul itself into the intermediate state and accounting for the physical resurrection. These are, again, foundational to Christian anthropology and the Christian anthropology that we have confessed for so long as Christians throughout much of its history or her history. Yet, panpsychism's emphasis on the ubiquitous, non individualized consciousness creates immediate tensions with these sorts of doctrines that we find codified in Christian theology throughout her history. And so this is not insignificant. This is a big problem. And so, whilst all philosophical views of the mind body relationship might have challenges and objections to them, they don't necessarily all begin with those challenges or create direct challenges for fundamental Christian commitments, which panpsychism does. It does. And here's the reason why. If you read her chapter, it's quite clear, and she's upfront about this and how she develops her version of panpsychism, which I want to say upfront lends itself to some version of substance dualism all the way down, where there are these substances of material and substances of immaterial, and these somehow interact with one another, or it might incline toward a version of idealism, not a version of materialism, although maybe it would be compatible with some sort of Russellian monism. But there is this persistent issue in panpsychism for explaining how micro level consciousnesses combine to form a unified macro level consciousness, particularly individualized, particularized human consciousness. This is a big problem, and the problem remains unresolved on most versions of panpsychism, even in Leidenhag's framework, which she is once again upfront about. You can go and read the chapter in the Origin of the Soul. Without a clear mechanism for combination, this theological panpsychism risks falling into utter incoherence. But it just doesn't seem to supply, certainly on the surface, um, a solution to the combinatorial problem, which creates a problem from the get-go foundationally for this panpsychism as being a good or adequate philosophical view on theological anthropology and how it is that we make sense of individualized human beings who themselves are conscious, something so central to the Christian faith itself. So, again, on a faith seeking understanding approach, this seems to be quite problematic and one that we cannot um, I don't think we can overstate in many ways. This isn't to say that maybe she could come up with solutions to the problem. Maybe she could, but it would certainly be quite downstream from the initial starting point of the system itself. Why adopt a system that creates these problems from the very get-go, foundationally, that create theological problems from the get-go? There are other alternatives and better alternatives to theological anthropology that have been advocated for throughout most of history that have come with different variations themselves. Of course, there are versions of substance dualism and even versions of Thomistic dualism that would be better than the panpsychist alternative. This is a significant problem, once again, for her theological panpsychism, and it bleeds over or overlaps with another problem. And that problem is the problem, you might argue, of substance demarcation, the demarcation of individualized or particularized substances themselves. Panpsychism's commitment to the ubiquity of consciousness complicates the demarcation of substances and how it is, once again, underlying the endurance problem, the endurance of one substance that exists, and how it is that it endures properly through time, and even more complicated when we add the disembodied intermediate state where it experiences arguably some substantial change. If it experiences a great change, a huge change, on her view, it seems to go through a substantial change itself. It becomes a distinct substance altogether. In other words, it doesn't endure through time or in and through time or across time into the afterlife. This is a problem. And so if consciousness can be diffused, it can be fissile, it can fuse even, as she advocates in her book or in her chapter in the Origin of the Soul conversation, then it raises the difficulty and the question, particularly as it's pronounced in her views, of how to reconcile panpsychism with traditional Christian views of the soul as a distinct and enduring entity in and through time and across time and into the afterlife. This is a problem, and it's a problem for attempting to provide a rational explanation for a faith commitment that we already have, that we commit to as Christians within some sort of broader confessional heritage. This is a problem, and it's a significant problem, I would suggest, that becomes even more problematic on her view than it does on the other theological views on offer in the Origin of the Soul conversation. The combination problem questions how it is that, again, particularized or individualized minds or proto-conscious entities combine to form a unified consciousness, which is related to this demarcation problem of substances and how it is the substance can be demarcated as this particular substance that can endure through time, and why it is that it would endure through time, and why it is that it wouldn't be or experience or encounter a significant, substantial change where it becomes a distinct type of or a distinct substance altogether in and through these significant changes, especially the losing of the body and the disembodied intermediate state. Again, Leidenhag's theological panpsychism grapples with this issue, but does not resolve it convincingly, arguably. And again, I'm summarizing some material. You can go and read her chapter. You can think about it for yourself and enter into some of the nitty-gritty debates about these issues. And this is something that Bruce Gordon really pressed on in the symposium discussion at the EPS conference that we were at a few weeks ago. If consciousness is ubiquitous and fundamental, how do discrete entities maintain their individuality? How is that? How does the combination of microconsciousnesses avoid significant or substantial change in the nature of the resulting macroconsciousnesses, namely human consciousnesses that arise through the evolutionary chain from lower level entities that are arguably conscious themselves or consciousness at least disposed? These challenges raise serious doubts about the viability of panpsychism's suitability as a proper starting point for theological reflection, and I would suggest you should adopt a different view altogether, some version of substance dualism or some version of idealism. In other words, panpsychism and theological construction, especially beginning from a faith-seeking understanding approach, is a problem. Panpsychism's popularity, while it's sparked valuable conversations about consciousness, the nature of persons, the universe's meaning, and her view is better than the alternatives in that it's very explicitly theistic. However, its fundamental or foundational assumptions are unresolved, or at least furnish unresolved issues, particularly the combination problem and the demarcation of substances. In other words, it makes it an unstable starting point for theological anthropology. As Leidenhag's work demonstrates, while theological panpsychism offers intriguing possibilities, it certainly is trendy today. It certainly is quite popular, and some would argue that it has the appeal of unifying nature in a more attractive, austere way. It encounters, again, significant obstacles when applied to core Christian doctrines. For theologians committed to a faith-seeking understanding approach, once again, beginning with panpsychism may not only prove problematic, but it also may detract from a more coherent and robust theological framework, say, in something like a theological anthropology that advocates for substance dualism or idealism itself, that can more naturally and provide a hospitable or habitable place for a change through time, endurance through time, as well as significant change when we encounter the disembodied intermediate state. Panpsychism's trendiness should invite critique rather than this kind of unquestioning acceptance that so many have had the attitude of, reminding us to carefully evaluate its claims and its limitations. So thanks again, Created Souls Podcasts. I'm looking forward to further conversations. Please feel free to discuss this issue, and please feel free also to subscribe, follow the podcast, as well as Soul Science Ministries. Follow us, subscribe, and let's continue the discussion as we think about this enduring question of, and this fundamental essence of what it means to be human, humans that are wonderfully made by a creator. So let's continue this discussion.